The chill of the autumn wind carried a sense of dread that seeped into Clara Harrington's bones as she stared at her reflection in the tarnished mirror. Tonight would be her wedding night, but there would be no joy in the union, only fear. Los Lunas, New Mexico Territory, 1885, was supposed to be her fresh start after her father's death, not her prison. Clara adjusted the white lace veil that cascaded down her back, contrasting with her rich auburn hair. At 22, she should have been excited about marriage, but instead her stomach churned with anxiety. The face staring back at her was pale, her green eyes wide with desperation. In less than an hour, she would be Mrs. Jeremiah Black, wife to the most feared man in the territory. "You look beautiful, Miss Clara," her maid, Sophie, whispered, pinning a final pearl into Clara's hair. "Though I wish the circumstances were different." "So do I," Clara replied, her voice barely audible. "I never thought I'd end up here being forced to marry a man twice my age, a man known for his cruelty." 3 months ago, Clara had arrived in Los Lunas with hope in her heart. Her father's death had left her with substantial debts, and her cousin in New Mexico had offered her a place to stay while she found her footing. What she hadn't known was that her cousin had already arranged for her to meet Jeremiah Black, the wealthiest rancher in the territory. Black had taken one look at Clara and decided she would be his wife. When she refused him, he'd revealed that he'd purchased all her father's debts. The choice was simple: marry him or watch as he seized what little remained of her family legacy, including the small house where her younger sister still lived back east. "Miss Clara," Sophie said hesitantly, "there's someone who wants to speak with you. He's waiting by the back entrance." Clara frowned. "Who?" "That new hand at the Black Ranch, Tanner Adamson, says it's urgent." Clara's pulse quickened. She'd only spoken to Tanner Adamson a handful of times since he'd started working for Black 3 weeks ago. He was tall, with sandy hair and kind blue eyes that seemed out of place on a man who worked for someone like Jeremiah Black. Unlike the other ranch hands who averted their gaze when she passed, Tanner had always tipped his hat and offered a smile that made her heart beat a little faster. "I can't possibly, please, miss." He seemed desperate, Sophie pleaded. "And Mr. Black is still at the saloon with his friends." Curiosity got the better of her. Clara nodded, and Sophie led her through the quiet corridors of the Black mansion to a small service entrance. There, standing in the shadow of an oak tree, was Tanner, his cowboy hat in his hands. "Miss Harrington," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I apologize for the impropriety, but I couldn't let this happen without offering my help." Clara stepped closer, keeping her voice hushed. "What do you mean?" "I know what kind of man Jeremiah Black is," Tanner said, his eyes darting to the main house. "I've seen what he does to those who cross him. I've heard how he speaks about you like your property he's acquired." Clara felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. "I have no choice, Mr. Adamson." "You do," he insisted. "I have horses ready. After the ceremony, when everyone's celebrating, I can help you escape. I know a place where you'll be safe until we can figure out how to protect your sister and deal with the debts. Why would you risk this for me?" Clara asked, studying his face for any sign of deception. Tanner hesitated. "Because no one deserves to be trapped like this, and because—" He paused, "because from the moment I saw you, I couldn't bear the thought of you being unhappy." Clara's heart hammered in her chest. It was madness to trust this man she barely knew, and yet the alternative was a lifetime with Jeremiah Black. She thought of the bruises she'd seen on his late wife's arms before her mysterious death last year. "The ceremony is at sundown," she whispered finally. "Black has arranged for a celebration afterward at the town hall. I'll be waiting behind the church with horses at 9 o'clock, Tanner said. "Wear something practical underneath your wedding dress." Before Clara could respond, they heard footsteps approaching. Tanner disappeared into the shadows as Sophie rushed back. "Miss Clara, you need to return. Mrs. Peterson is looking for you and the carriage will be here any minute." With a racing heart, Clara followed Sophie back to her room. As she donned her wedding dress, a garment that felt more like a shroud than a symbol of joy, she made her decision. Tonight, she would either escape Jeremiah Black or resign herself to a life of misery. The church bells of Los Lunas rang out as the sun began to dip below the mountains to the west. Clara stood at the back of the small stone church, her arm linked with her cousin Edward's. Through her veil, she could see Jeremiah Black waiting at the altar, his imposing figure clad in an expensive black suit. At 54, his once dark hair was now streaked with silver, and his face was lined with the evidence of a hard life, but his eyes remained sharp and cold. "You look pale, cousin," Edward whispered as they prepared to walk down the aisle. "Remember our agreement, this marriage saves both our families from ruin." Clara didn't respond. Edward had been more than willing to offer her up as a sacrifice to keep his own finances secure. She scanned the small crowd, spotting several of Black's business associates and a few curious townspeople. Near the back, partially hidden by a column, stood Tanner. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave an almost imperceptible nod. The ceremony passed in a blur of words that Clara barely heard. When asked if she took Jeremiah Black as her husband, she forced the word yes past her lips, feeling as though she might be sick. When Black slid the gold band onto her finger, his grip was tight enough to hurt. "You're mine now," he whispered as he lifted her veil to place a dry kiss on her lips. His breath smelled of whiskey and cigars. The reception at the town hall was a raucous affair, with Black's friends congratulating him on securing such a young, beautiful bride. Clara sat at the head table, barely touching her food, watching as Black drank more with each passing hour. By 8:30, he was deep in conversation with the town's banker, gesturing wildly as he boasted about his latest business venture. Sophie appeared at Clara's side, placing a shawl around her shoulders. "It's getting chilly," she said loudly, then leaned in to whisper, "Mr. Adamson is ready." "There's a door behind the kitchen that leads to the alley." Clara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. She waited until Black was engrossed in another conversation before rising from her seat. "I need some air," she told the woman beside her, forcing a smile. She made her way through the crowded room, nodding politely to well-wishers until she reached the kitchen. The staff was busy preparing more food, and no one paid her any mind as she slipped through the back door. The night air was cool on her face as she stepped into the alley. For a terrifying moment, she thought Tanner wasn't there. Then a shadow moved and he emerged from behind a stack of crates, leading 2 saddled horses. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I couldn't stay," Clara replied, pulling off her veil and stuffing it into a saddlebag. Beneath her wedding dress, she wore a simple blouse and riding skirt, as Tanner had suggested. "We need to hurry," Tanner said, helping her mount one of the horses. Once Black realizes you're gone, as if summoned by his name, a roar erupted from inside the town hall. "Where is she?" Clara's blood ran cold. "He knows. Ride," Tanner commanded, swinging onto his own horse. "Follow me and don't look back." They spurred their horses down the alley and onto a side street, keeping to the shadows. Behind them, Clara could hear shouting and the sound of doors slamming. As they reached the edge of town, she risked a glance back and saw several men on horseback emerging from the town hall, Jeremiah Black at their lead. "They're coming," she cried. Tanner led them off the main trail and into the dense forest that bordered Las Lunas to the east. The darkness beneath the trees was almost complete, but Tanner seemed to know where he was going, navigating the uneven terrain with confidence. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 10 miles from here," he called over his shoulder. "We can hide there tonight and continue north in the morning." They rode hard for what felt like hours, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter until they could no longer hear anything but the natural sounds of the forest. Clara's muscles ached from the unfamiliar exertion, but fear kept her moving forward. Finally, Tanner slowed his pace, leading them along a barely visible path that wound deeper into the woods. The cabin, when they reached it, was little more than a one-room structure with a sagging roof, but it offered shelter from the increasingly cold night. Tanner quickly got a small fire going in the stone fireplace while Clara stood by the window, peering anxiously into the darkness. "You think they'll find us?" she asked. "Not tonight," Tanner assured her, though his expression remained vigilant. "We crossed a stream back there that should mask our trail, and Black doesn't know these woods like I do." Clara sank onto a rough wooden chair, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what she'd done. I've never defied anyone like this before, she admitted. Even when my father insisted I learn to run the household after my mother died, I obeyed without question. Tanner knelt by the fire, adding another small log. Sometimes defiance is the only way to survive, he said quietly. I learned that early on. How do you know Jeremiah Black? Clara asked, studying Tanner's profile in the firelight. You've only worked for him a short time, but you seem to understand what kind of man he is. Tanner was silent for a long moment. I've been tracking Black for almost a year, he finally said. My sister worked as a maid in his house before he married his last wife. His voice faltered. She was found dead behind the stables. Black claimed she fell from a hayloft, but my sister was afraid of heights. She never would have climbed up there. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. You believe he killed her? I know he did, Tanner said grimly, but I couldn't prove it. So I've been working my way closer to him, looking for evidence, for anything that might bring him to justice. Then you arrived in town, and I saw history beginning to repeat itself. His last wife, Clara whispered. There were rumors. Tanner nodded. Black has a pattern. He finds vulnerable women with few options, forces them into marriage, and when they become too troublesome or he tires of them. He didn't finish the sentence. Clara shivered despite the fire's warmth. What will we do now? He won't let me go easily. His pride won't allow it. We'll head north to Santa Fe, Tanner said. I have friends there who can help us contact your sister, make arrangements to get her to safety. Then we'll figure out how to deal with your father's debts. Why are you risking so much for me? Clara asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since he first offered his help. Tanner met her gaze, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. At first, it was because I saw you as another potential victim of Black's cruelty. But then... He looked away. Then I got to know you, your kindness to the ranch hands, the way you stood up to Black when he mistreated his stable boy, your quiet strength. I couldn't stand by and watch your spirit be broken. Clara felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time since arriving in Las Lunas, she felt a flicker of hope. We should rest, Tanner said, breaking the moment. We'll need to leave before dawn. He offered Clara the cabin's only cot while he prepared to sleep on the floor near the fire. As Clara lay down, still wearing her riding clothes, she realized that despite the danger and uncertainty ahead, she felt safer with this man she barely knew than she ever had as Jeremiah Black's fiancé. Thank you, Tanner, she whispered into the darkness. From his place by the fire, Tanner's voice came soft and steady. Get some sleep, Clara. Tomorrow we start fighting back. Dawn broke with a misty rain that shrouded the forest in gray. Tanner was already awake, checking their supplies and peering out the cabin's single window. Clara rose quickly, smoothing her rumpled clothes and pulling her hair back into a practical braid. We need to move, Tanner said, handing her a piece of dried beef and a canteen. Black knows these territories. He'll have men at every major road and crossing by now. Where will we go? Clara asked, quickly eating the meager breakfast. There's an old mining trail that runs along the ridge, Tanner explained, shouldering a small pack. It's rough terrain, but it'll keep us hidden until we reach the Ortiz Mountains. From there, we can make our way to Santa Fe. They set out in the gray light, leading their horses through the dense underbrush until they reached the trail Tanner had mentioned. It was barely visible, overgrown in places and treacherous in others where the rain had made the ground slippery. As they rode, Clara found herself studying Tanner when he wasn't looking. There was a quiet competence about him that she found reassuring. His hands were calloused from work, but they handled the reins with gentle confidence. When he helped her navigate a particularly steep section of trail, his touch was respectful and careful. How did you learn to navigate like this? She asked as they paused to let the horses drink from a small stream. A half smile crossed Tanner's face. My father was a scout for the army. He taught me to read the land, to find paths where others only see wilderness. And your mother, she died when I was 10. Consumption. After that, it was just my father, my sister, and me, moving from post to post until he was killed in a skirmish with Comanche raiders when I was 16. I'm sorry, Clara said softly. I lost my mother young as well. It leaves a hole that never quite fills. Tanner nodded, then tensed suddenly, his head tilting. "Get down," he whispered urgently, pulling her from her horse and into the cover of some large boulders. Moments later, the sound of hoofbeats reached them, several horses moving rapidly along a parallel trail below them. Through the trees, Clara caught glimpses of riders, and her heart seized when she recognized the broad-shouldered figure of Jeremiah Black at their head. "How did they find us?" she whispered, pressing herself against the cool stone. "They're following the main trail," Tanner replied. "They haven't spotted us yet, but they're heading in the same direction we are." They remained hidden until the riders had passed, then cautiously returned to their horses. "We need to change our route," Tanner said, studying the position of the sun through the clouds. "There's a homestead about 5 miles east of here. The family that lives there, the Murphys, they're good people. They might be willing to shelter us for the night." Clara hesitated. "I don't want to bring trouble to innocent people. Sean Murphy owes me a favor," Tanner explained. "I helped his son when he was thrown from a horse last spring, and they have no love for Black. He's been trying to force them off their land for years." They altered their course, moving deeper into the forest, away from the trail Black and his men were following. The rain had stopped, but the foliage remained wet, soaking Clara's skirts as they pushed through the undergrowth. By late afternoon, they emerged from the trees to see a modest homestead nestled in a small valley, a sturdy log house, a barn, and several fenced fields where cattle grazed. Tanner approached cautiously, alert for any sign of danger. A woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron, her expression wary until she recognized Tanner. "Mr. Adamson," she called, shading her eyes against the westering sun. "What brings you out this way, Mrs. Murphy?" Tanner greeted her, dismounting. "We're in need of shelter, if you can spare it, just for the night." The woman, middle-aged with streaks of gray in her dark hair, looked from Tanner to Clara, her sharp eyes taking in Clara's fine riding clothes and exhausted appearance. "You'd better come in," she said finally. "Sean's out with the herd, but he'll be back by sundown." Inside, the Murphy home was simple but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace and handmade furniture. Mrs. Murphy Margaret, as she insisted Clara call her, provided them with hot food and coffee, asking few questions but occasionally casting curious glances at Clara's gold wedding band. "You're running from Jeremiah Black, aren't you?" she finally said as she poured more coffee. Clara nearly choked on her stew. "How did you news travels fast, even out here?" Margaret said grimly. "Word is he's offering a reward for information about his runaway bride." Tanner's expression darkened. "Did anyone see us approach your home?" Margaret shook her head. "No, but you should know that Black and some of his men stopped here earlier today, asking if we'd seen anyone matching your description." Clara felt sick. "What did you tell them?" "That we hadn't seen a soul," Margaret replied firmly. "Sean and I have no reason to help that man. He's been trying to drive us off our land for 3 years, claiming our water rights infringe on his territory." The sound of the front door opening made them all tense, but it was only Sean Murphy, a weathered man with kind eyes who seemed unsurprised to find fugitives at his dinner table. "Tanner Adamson," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Heard you were in some trouble." "I'm sorry to bring it to your doorstep, Sean," Tanner replied, standing to shake the man's hand. Sean waved away his concern. "Any enemy of Black's is a friend of mine." He turned to Clara, bowing slightly. "Mrs. Black, I presume—" "It's still Harrington," Clara said firmly. "The marriage was forced, and I have no intention of honoring it." Sean nodded approvingly. "Good for you. Not many would have the courage to defy a man like Black." As the evening progressed, they shared their story with the Murphys, who listened with growing concern. "Black won't stop looking," Sean warned. "His pride won't allow it, and he has friends in high places. The territorial marshal in Santa Fe is his cousin." Tanner frowned. "I didn't know that." "It changes our plans." "What will we do?" Clara asked, feeling the brief sense of security slipping away. "I have another friend in Albuquerque," Tanner said thoughtfully. "He runs a freight company that ships goods all the way to California. If we can reach him, he might be able to help us get further west." "California," Clara repeated. It seemed impossibly far away, and yet the thought of a place where Jeremiah Black's influence couldn't reach was tempting. "You'd need to disappear completely," Margaret said, practical as ever. "New names, new histories." Clara thought of her sister back east. "I can't abandon my sister." "We'll find a way to bring her to you," Tanner promised. "Once we're safe." That night, the Murphys insisted they take their son's room, now empty since he'd married and moved to his own homestead. Despite her exhaustion, Clara found it hard to sleep, her mind racing with fears and doubts. "Tanner," she whispered into the darkness, knowing he was on a pallet on the floor, "are we doing the right thing?" There was a long pause before he answered. "I believe we are." "Black is not a man who should have power over anyone, least of all someone like you." "But at what cost?" Clara persisted. "The Murphys could lose everything for helping us. You're risking your life, and my sister, Clara," Tanner interrupted gently, "sometimes the right path is the hardest one. I've spent my life regretting the times I didn't stand up against injustice. I won't make that mistake again." In the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains, Clara could just make out his profile as he sat up to look at her. "When my sister died," he continued, his voice low, "I knew Black was responsible, but I had no proof. I was young and afraid, so I walked away. Every day since then, I've carried the weight of that decision. I won't let another woman suffer at his hands if I can prevent it." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the raw emotion in his voice. "I'm sorry about your sister. What was her name?" "Elizabeth," Tanner replied softly. "She was 19. Impulsively, Clara reached out, finding his hand in the darkness. "Thank you for helping me, Tanner. Whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm grateful." His fingers tightened around hers briefly before he gently pulled away. "Get some sleep, Clara. Tomorrow will be another long day." But sleep remained elusive as Clara stared at the ceiling, acutely aware of Tanner's presence just a few feet away. In the short time she'd known him, he'd shown more concern for her well-being than any man ever had, including her own father. It was a strange feeling to be valued for herself, not for what she could provide or represent, and though she tried to deny it, there was something else growing in her heart, a warm, tentative feeling that both frightened and exhilarated her. It was too soon, too dangerous to acknowledge. And yet, as she finally drifted toward sleep, her last conscious thought was of Tanner's blue eyes and the way they seemed to see into her soul. They left the Murphy homestead before dawn, supplied with fresh provisions and Sean's best advice on avoiding the main routes to Albuquerque. Clara had embraced Margaret warmly, touched by the woman's kindness to strangers in need. "Be careful," Margaret had whispered, "and be happy. Every woman deserves that chance." Now, as they rode through the misty morning, Clara felt a new determination. She had spent too long letting others dictate her life, her father, her cousin, and finally Black. It was time to claim her own path. "How far to Albuquerque?" she asked, guiding her horse alongside Tanner's. "About 3 days' ride at our pace," he replied. "We'll need to cross the Rio Grande, but Sean told me about a ford that's rarely used. With luck, Black's men won't be watching it." They traveled steadily through the day, keeping to wooded areas when possible and high ground where they could spot anyone following. By mid-afternoon, the skies had cleared, revealing a vast New Mexico landscape of mesas and distant mountains. "It's beautiful," Clara remarked as they paused on a ridge. "I never really looked at it before I was too afraid." Tanner smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "That's what I love about this territory. It's harsh, but there's a freedom here you can't find in the East." "Have you always lived in the West?" Clara asked, curious about the man who had risked everything to help her. "Since I was 8, Tanner replied. "Before that, we lived in Pennsylvania. My father worked in the coal mines until a cave-in nearly killed him. That's when he decided to join the army and head west. And you, what did you want to be before?" She hesitated. "Before I became obsessed with bringing Jeremiah Black to justice." Tanner finished with a wry smile. "I wanted to have my own ranch. Nothing fancy, just good land, some cattle, horses, a place that was mine." His expression grew distant. "Maybe someday." "It's a good dream," Clara said softly. "My mother used to say that dreams are like stars, they guide us even on the darkest nights." Tanner looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was, Clara agreed, her heart aching with the old grief. She taught me to read, to love books. My father thought it was a waste of time for a girl, but she insisted. After she died, books became my escape. What did you dream of? Tanner asked. Before all this, Clara hesitated. No one had ever asked her that question before. I wanted to teach, she admitted, to have a little school somewhere and share the joy of learning with children. But when my mother died, my father needed me to run the household, and then when he died. She shrugged. Dreams change, I suppose. They don't have to, Tanner said. Not permanently. Before Clara could respond, Tanner suddenly stiffened, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Riders, he said tersely, coming fast from the east. Clara turned to look. On the plain below, a cloud of dust marked the approach of several horsemen, still too far to identify but moving with purpose. Black's men? She asked, her mouth suddenly dry. Likely, Tanner said, already turning his horse. We need to move. There's a canyon ahead that can provide cover. They rode hard, pushing their horses to a gallop as they descended from the ridge. The canyon Tanner had mentioned came into view, a deep gash in the earth with steep walls and a narrow entrance. Stay close, Tanner called as they entered the shadowy confines of the canyon. The path narrows ahead. The walls rose around them, blocking the afternoon sun and creating an eerie twilight. The path indeed grew narrower, forcing them to ride single file, with Tanner leading the way. The sound of their horses' hooves echoed off the stone, making Clara constantly glance behind them, afraid that their pursuers were gaining. After what felt like an eternity, the canyon widened again into a small, sheltered valley with a spring bubbling from the rocks and enough grass for the horses to graze. We'll rest here for a bit, Tanner decided, dismounting. The horses need water, and there's only one way in or out of this valley. We'll hear anyone approaching. Clara slid from her saddle, her legs trembling from the hard ride. Do you think we lost them? For now, Tanner said, though his expression remained vigilant as he helped Clara lead the horses to the spring. As the animals drank, Clara sank onto a flat rock, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. They had been riding for nearly 2 days with little rest, constantly looking over their shoulders. The strain was beginning to show. You should eat something, Tanner said, offering her some of the jerky and hardtack Margaret Murphy had packed for them. Clara accepted gratefully, realizing she was famished. They ate in companionable silence, the tension of the chase gradually easing from their shoulders as the peaceful valley worked its calming magic. We can stay here until dusk, Tanner decided, then continue through the canyon. It opens into a series of smaller canyons that are difficult to navigate in daylight, let alone darkness, but I know the way. Black's men won't follow us through there at night. You seem to know every hidden trail in the territory, Clara observed. A shadow crossed Tanner's face. After Elizabeth died, I spent a year just wandering. I couldn't settle anywhere. I took jobs as a guide, a tracker, anything that kept me moving. I learned the land because it was the only thing that made sense to me then. Clara's heart ached for him. She understood that restlessness, that need to keep moving to outrun grief. After her mother's death, she had thrown herself into running the household, working from dawn until night fell, because stillness brought too many painful memories. It gets easier, she said quietly. The grief, I mean. It never goes away completely, but eventually it becomes a part of you rather than all of you. Tanner looked at her with surprise, as though he hadn't expected her to understand. Yes, he said simply, that's exactly it. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft sounds of the horses grazing and the gentle murmur of the spring. In that moment of peace, Clara found herself studying Tanner's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the tiny scar above his right eyebrow, the way his sandy hair curled slightly where it touched his collar. As though sensing her gaze, he turned and their eyes met. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the connection that had been growing since that first conversation behind the Black Mansion. Tanner was the first to look away, clearing his throat. We should check the horses, make sure they're fit for the night ride. They spent the remaining daylight hours resting and preparing for the journey ahead. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley floor, Tanner grew increasingly alert, scanning the canyon entrance. "Something's wrong," he said suddenly, moving to retrieve his rifle from his saddle. "It's too quiet." Clara listened, and indeed, the natural sounds of the valley birds, insects, the rustle of small animals had gone silent. "Get to the horses," Tanner ordered, his voice low and urgent. "Be ready to ride." Before they could move, however, a voice called from the rocks above them. "I wouldn't if I were you." Clara froze, her blood turning to ice as she recognized the voice. Slowly, she turned to look up at the rim of the valley. There, silhouetted against the darkening sky, sat Jeremiah Black on his massive black stallion, a rifle resting casually across his lap. Behind him were 5 of his men, all armed. "My dear wife," Black called, his voice dripping with false affection. "You've led me on quite a chase." Tanner stepped in front of Clara, his rifle at the ready. "She's not your wife, Black. The marriage was forced." Black laughed, the sound echoing unpleasantly off the canyon walls. "The law says otherwise, Adamson, as does the ring on her finger." Clara touched the gold band she had forgotten to remove, feeling sick. "Now," Black continued, "I'm a reasonable man. Return my wife to me, Adamson, and I might let you ride away from this. Continue to interfere and—" He let the threat hang in the air. "Clara," Tanner said quietly, not taking his eyes off Black, "get on your horse." "But trust me," he whispered. "When I give the signal, ride hard for the canyon exit, the one behind us, not the way we came in." Clara moved slowly toward her horse, trying not to draw attention. Black's men had begun to descend the steep path from the rim, their weapons trained on Tanner. "This is your last chance, Adamson," Black called. "Step away from my wife." "She doesn't belong to you or anyone else," Tanner replied, his voice steady despite the danger. Black's face hardened. "I was hoping you'd say that." He raised his rifle. In one fluid motion, Tanner fired at the rocks above Black's head, sending a shower of stone fragments down on the rancher and his men. "Now," he shouted to Clara. Clara swung onto her horse, spurring it toward the narrow exit at the far end of the valley. Behind her, she heard shouts and gunfire. Looking back, she saw Tanner mount his own horse in a leap that would have impressed even the most seasoned vaquero, racing after her as bullets kicked up dust around him. The exit to the canyon was so narrow they had to ride single file, the walls so close that Clara's knees occasionally brushed against the rough stone. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as Black and his men struggled to navigate the treacherous terrain in the gathering darkness. The canyon twisted and turned, branching into multiple passages. Tanner took the lead, guiding them through the maze with unerring confidence despite the rapidly fading light. "How did they find us?" Clara gasped as they finally emerged into open country, the first stars appearing overhead. "I don't know," Tanner admitted, scanning the horizon. "But we need to keep moving. There's a line shack about 5 miles from here where we can rest for a few hours." They rode in silence, both too focused on the dangers behind them to speak. The line shack, when they reached it, was little more than a crude shelter with a small stove and a single cot, but it offered protection from the increasingly cold night air. Tanner secured the horses while Clara attempted to get a fire started in the stove. Her hands were shaking so badly that she struggled with the matches until Tanner gently took them from her. "Let me," he said, quickly coaxing a flame from the dry kindling. As warmth began to fill the small space, Clara sank onto a wooden crate, suddenly overwhelmed. "He found us," she whispered. "He'll always find us." Tanner knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his. "Look at me, Clara." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his. "Black found us because he has resources and men who fear him, but we have something he doesn't. We're fighting for something worth fighting for." "Freedom?" Clara asked softly. "Justice," Tanner replied. "And yes, freedom." And he stopped, seeming uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. "And what?" she prompted. He held her gaze, his blue eyes intense in the flickering light from the stove. "And something I never expected to find when I came to Los Lunas." Clara's heart skipped a beat as she realized what he wasn't saying. Tanner, he stood abruptly, releasing her hands. You should rest, I'll keep watch. Clara watched as he moved to the small window, rifle in hand, his shoulders tense. She wanted to go to him, to acknowledge the unspoken feelings growing between them, but now wasn't the time. They were still in danger, still running for their lives. Instead, she settled onto the cot, pulling a thin blanket over herself. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive, her mind replaying the moment in the valley when Black had appeared, the terror she had felt, and the fierce protection Tanner had shown. Eventually, her eyes grew heavy, and she drifted into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of pursuit and danger. At some point, she became aware of a gentle touch on her forehead, fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. She opened her eyes to see Tanner standing over her, his expression tender in the dim light. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to wake you." "It's all right," she murmured. "Have you slept at all?" He shook his head. "I'll rest when we're safe." Clara sat up, making room on the narrow cot. "At least sit down. You can watch the door from here just as well." After a moment's hesitation, Tanner sat beside her, his weight making the old cot creak. They remained like that in comfortable silence, shoulders touching, both finding solace in the simple proximity. "My father used to say that trouble shared is trouble halved," Clara said finally. "I think he was right." Tanner smiled faintly. "My father had a similar saying, no man stands as tall as when he stoops to help another." "He sounds like a good man." "He was," Tanner agreed. "He would have liked you." Clara felt a warmth spread through her at his words. "And your sister, what was she like?" "Elizabeth was stubborn," Tanner said with a soft laugh. "Determined to make her own way. She was smart, too, could read and write better than most men. She took the job at Black's Ranch because she wanted to save enough money to go to that new women's college back east." Vassar. Clara asked, surprised. Tanner nodded. "She had dreams beyond what most people thought possible for a girl from nowhere." "She sounds remarkable," Clara said. "Like her brother." Tanner looked at her then, his expression unguarded for perhaps the first time since they'd met. "Clara, when this is over, when you're safe, I want you to know that the sound of approaching horses cut him off. Both of them tensed, listening intently to the rhythm of hoofbeats drawing nearer. "That's not Black's men," Tanner said, moving to the window. "They're coming from the west, not the east." Clara joined him, peering into the darkness. In the faint moonlight, she could make out 3 riders approaching the line shack at a steady pace. "Who?" she began, but Tanner was already smiling. "Friends," he said with evident relief. "That's Sean Murphy and his sons." Sure enough, as the riders drew closer, Clara recognized the weathered face of their host from the previous night. Sean dismounted and approached the shack, raising his hand in greeting. "Tanner, Miss Harrington," he called softly. "Glad we found you." Tanner opened the door, ushering the men inside. "How did you know where to look?" "Figured you'd head for Hawkins Canyon," Sean replied, stomping the dust from his boots. "It's the route you'd take if you were trying to avoid the main trails to Albuquerque." "But why are you here?" Clara asked, concerned. "Has something happened?" Sean's expression grew grim. "Black and his men came back to our place after losing your trail. They weren't gentle in their questioning," Clara gasped, noting for the first time the bruise darkening Sean's left cheek. "Oh, Sean, I'm so sorry." "Don't be," he interrupted firmly. "Margaret and I made our choice to help you, and we'd make it again, but it's not safe for you to continue to Albuquerque. Black's got men watching all the approaches to the city." "What about your friend there?" Clara asked Tanner. "The one with the freight company." "There's another way to reach him," Sean's eldest son Patrick spoke up. "The railroad. There's a small station about 20 miles west of here, mostly used for shipping cattle, but they take passengers too." Tanner considered this. "Black will have thought of that too." "Yes, but he won't be looking for a family of settlers," Sean said with a sly smile. "We brought some of Margaret's clothes for Miss Harrington, and we have a wagon waiting about a mile from here. You'll travel as Patrick's wife, with me and young Sean as your family, heading west to start a new life." Clara looked at Tanner, uncertain. "What about you?" "I'll ride alongside as a hired hand," Tanner said, catching on to the plan. "It could work. Black would never expect us to travel so openly." As dawn approached, they put Sean's plan into action. Clara changed into the simple cotton dress Margaret had sent, tying her hair back with a plain ribbon. Tanner smeared dirt on their wagon to make it look well-traveled and rearranged their supplies to give the appearance of a family's possessions. "One more thing," Sean said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out 2 simple gold bands. "You'll need to look the part." Clara stared at the rings, then at Tanner, who seemed equally surprised. "Where did you get these?" she asked. "They were my parents'," Patrick explained. "I've kept them since they passed, thought they might be useful for your disguise." With a strange flutter in her stomach, Clara allowed Patrick to slip one of the rings onto her finger, replacing the ostentatious band Black had forced on her. Tanner accepted the other ring with a nod of thanks, sliding it onto his own finger without ceremony. "Mrs. Adamson," he said with a formal nod, though his eyes held a warmth that made Clara's cheeks heat. "Mr. Adamson," she replied, attempting to match his casual tone despite the way her heart raced at the pretense. They set out as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern hills, Clara riding in the wagon with young Sean while Tanner, Patrick, and the elder Sean rode alongside. They kept to the main trail now, part of their strategy to hide in plain sight. The morning passed without incident, though Clara couldn't help tensing every time they encountered other travelers. By midday, they had covered considerable distance, stopping briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch. "We're making good time," Sean observed, studying the position of the sun. "Should reach the station by nightfall." As they prepared to continue their journey, the sound of approaching riders made them all freeze. Around a bend in the trail came 4 men on horseback, all wearing the distinctive hats of the territorial law enforcement. "Deputies," Tanner muttered, moving closer to Clara. "Act natural." The deputies slowed as they approached, the lead officer raising his hand in greeting. "Morning, folks," he called. "Where you headed?" "West," Sean replied easily. "Taking my son and his wife to California. Heard there's good land still available in the San Joaquin Valley." The deputy nodded, his gaze sliding over their group until it landed on Clara. She forced herself to smile, leaning slightly against Tanner, who had positioned himself beside the wagon. "We're looking for some fugitives," the deputy said. "A woman and a man who abducted her on her wedding night. Nasty business." "That's so," Sean said, sounding appropriately concerned. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description. Have we, Patrick?" Patrick shook his head. "No, sir, just been us on the trail since we left Las Cruces yesterday." The deputy studied them for another long moment before apparently deciding they weren't worth further investigation. "Well, keep an eye out. The woman's husband is offering a substantial reward for information leading to their capture." "We'll certainly do that," Sean assured him. With a final nod, the deputies continued on their way, heading east toward the territory they had just traveled through. Clara released the breath she'd been holding, her hands trembling. "That was close," she whispered. "Too close," Tanner agreed, his expression grim. "Black's got the law involved now. He's claiming I abducted you." "But that's not true," Clara protested. "Truth doesn't always matter when money and influence are involved," Sean said sagely. "All the more reason to get you to that train station as quickly as possible." They continued their journey with renewed urgency, pushing the horses harder than before. As the sun began to set, the small railway station came into view, a modest wooden building beside a single track stretching east to west as far as the eye could see. "I'll go check the schedule," Patrick volunteered, riding ahead. Clara watched him go, anxiety gnawing at her stomach. "What if there's no train today?" "Then we'll wait," Tanner said firmly. "We've come too far to turn back now." Patrick returned with good news. A train was due to arrive within the hour, bound for Albuquerque and points west. They arranged for tickets, using the story of the family traveling to California, and settled in to wait. The small station was nearly empty, with only a sleepy-looking station master and a couple of freight handlers present. Clara sat on a bench with young Sean beside her, trying to appear calm despite her racing heart. Tanner paced nearby, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. As the minutes ticked by, Clara found herself thinking about what would happen once they reached Albuquerque. Would they continue west to California? Would Tanner stay with her, or would he feel his duty discharged once she was safely away from Black's reach? The thought of continuing alone made her heart ache in a way she wasn't prepared for. The distant whistle of an approaching train broke into her thoughts. Relief washed over her as she stood, gathering the small bundle of possessions they had brought. "Thank you," she said to Sean and his sons. "I don't know how we can ever repay you for your kindness." Sean waved away her gratitude. "Living well is the best revenge against men like Black. You go and build a good life, Miss Harrington. That's all the payment we need." The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a billowing cloud of steam. Passengers disembarked and freight was quickly unloaded. In the commotion, Clara and Tanner said their final goodbyes to the Murphys and boarded the train, finding seats in a nearly empty passenger car. As the train began to pull away from the station, Clara leaned against the window, watching the Murphys grow smaller in the distance. Only when they had disappeared from view did she allow herself to relax slightly. "We did it," she whispered, turning to Tanner. "We're actually getting away." Tanner's smile was cautious. "It's a good start, but we're not safe yet." "Will we ever be?" Clara asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind finally voiced. Tanner reached across the space between their seats, taking her hand in his. "Yes," he said with a certainty that calmed her racing thoughts. "I promise you, Clara, one day you'll be able to live without looking over your shoulder, and when that day comes—" He hesitated. "When that day comes," she prompted gently. His eyes met hers, filled with an emotion that made her breath catch. "When that day comes, I hope I'm still by your side." Clara's heart swelled with a feeling too new and precious to name. "I hope so too," she whispered. The train rumbled through the New Mexico night, carrying them toward an uncertain future, but one that, for the first time since Clara had arrived in Los Lunas, held the promise of hope and maybe, just maybe, happiness. The journey to Albuquerque passed without incident, the rhythmic swaying of the train lulling Clara into a light sleep. She awoke to find her head resting on Tanner's shoulder, his arm protectively around her. For a moment she allowed herself to enjoy the closeness, the feeling of safety his presence provided. "We're almost there," Tanner said softly, noticing she was awake. "About 20 minutes out." Clara sat up, smoothing her hair and trying to ignore the blush warming her cheeks. "What's the plan once we arrive?" "My friend Thomas runs the Western Freight Company," Tanner explained. "Their office is near the depot. If we're lucky, he'll be there despite the late hour." The train pulled into Albuquerque shortly after midnight. The station was quiet, with only a few passengers disembarking. Tanner led Clara quickly through the nearly empty streets, keeping to the shadows when possible. The Western Freight Company building was a substantial brick structure near the rail yards, its windows dark except for a single lamp burning in an upstairs office. "That's a good sign," Tanner said, approaching the side entrance. He knocked in a particular pattern 3 quick raps, followed by 2 slower ones. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard. "Tanner Adamson," he said with evident surprise. "I thought you were still hunting your demons in Los Lunas." "Hello, Thomas," Tanner replied. "May we come in? It's urgent." Thomas's gaze shifted to Clara, his expression curious but not unfriendly. "Of course." He stepped aside, allowing them to enter a small office area. "And who might this be?" "Clara Harrington," Tanner said, then hesitated before adding, "She's under my protection." Understanding dawned on Thomas's face. "Ah, the rumors have reached even here Jeremiah Black's runaway bride." Clara tensed, but Thomas quickly raised a hand in a placating gesture. "Don't worry, Miss Harrington. Any enemy of Black's is a friend of mine." "That seems to be a common sentiment," Clara observed, relaxing slightly. "Black has a talent for making enemies," Thomas said dryly. "Come upstairs. We can talk more comfortably there." The upper office was sparse but well-appointed, with a large desk, several chairs, and maps covering the walls. Thomas poured them each a cup of coffee from a pot kept warm on a small stove. "Now," he said, settling behind his desk, "what can I do for you?" Tanner explained their situation briefly, ending with their need to get far from Black's influence as quickly as possible. We were hoping you might have a freight wagon heading west soon. Thomas stroked his beard thoughtfully. As it happens, I have a shipment leaving for Santa Fe tomorrow. From there, it connects with another headed to California. But, he frowned. Black has friends in Santa Fe, as I'm sure you know. The territorial marshal is his cousin, Tanner confirmed grimly. That complicates matters, Thomas admitted. However, I do have another option. He pulled out a map, spreading it across the desk. There's a smaller route my company uses for special shipments. It bypasses Santa Fe entirely, heading northwest through the mountains before turning west toward Arizona territory. Clara leaned forward, studying the route. It looks more difficult. It is, Thomas agreed. Rougher terrain, fewer settlements, but also fewer eyes watching for fugitives. When does the next wagon leave? Tanner asked. That's the issue, not for another week. Thomas held up his hand as Tanner began to protest. But I own a small property about 5 miles outside of town, a hunting cabin, rarely used this time of year. You'd be welcome to stay there while you wait. Clara and Tanner exchanged glances. A week seemed like an eternity when they were running for their lives, but they had few options. Thank you, Clara said finally. We accept your kind offer. Thomas nodded, folding the map. I'll arrange for supplies to be delivered tomorrow. Tonight, I suggest you rest here. I have a small apartment upstairs that I use when working late. With that settled, Thomas showed them to the apartment, a simple space with a small kitchen, a sitting area, and a bedroom. I'll sleep in my office, he insisted when Tanner protested. I've done it many times before. Left alone, Clara and Tanner stood awkwardly in the small sitting room, the intimacy of their surroundings suddenly apparent. You take the bedroom, Tanner said quickly. I'll be fine out here. Clara nodded, too exhausted to argue. The bedroom was modest but clean, with a comfortable-looking bed and a small window overlooking the rail yards. She removed her borrowed dress, slipping beneath the covers in her chemise and petticoat. Despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her. Every sound from outside made her tense, expecting Black or his men to appear at any moment. After an hour of restless turning, she rose and made her way back to the sitting room. Tanner was still awake, sitting by the window with his rifle across his knees. He turned at her approach, his expression concerned. Can't sleep? He asked softly. Clara shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. Every time I close my eyes, I see Black finding us. Tanner set aside his rifle and stood, crossing to where she stood. He won't find us here. Thomas is trustworthy and no one saw us arrive. It's not just that, Clara admitted. It's everything, my sister, the debts, the future. I've never been this uncertain about anything in my life. Tanner's expression softened. He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished, and drew her into his arms. Clara went willingly, resting her head against his chest, finding comfort in his steady heartbeat. One step at a time, he murmured into her hair. We'll get to California, we'll send for your sister. And as for the debts, he hesitated. Clara looked up at him. What? I've been thinking about that, Tanner said, his blue eyes serious. Black claimed to have purchased your father's debts, but did you ever see proof of that? Clara blinked, surprised by the question. No. He just told my cousin, who told me. Then it's possible he was lying. It would be like him to use such a tactic to force your hand. Hope flared briefly in Clara's chest, but she tamped it down. Even if that's true, the debts still exist. Someone holds them. Yes, but if we can discover who that someone is, we might be able to negotiate terms that don't involve you being forced into marriage. Clara considered this possibility. It would mean returning east eventually. When it's safe, Tanner agreed. But first, we need to ensure Black can't harm you. Clara nodded, then impulsively reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. The atmosphere between them shifted, the air suddenly charged with something beyond gratitude. Tanner's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a silent question in their depths. Clara answered by rising onto her tiptoes, pressing her lips gently to his. For a moment, Tanner seemed frozen in surprise, but then his arms tightened around her, and he returned the kiss with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Tanner rested his forehead against hers. "Clara," he said softly, "I want you to know that I care for you deeply, but I don't want you to feel obligated in any way because of what I've done." "Obligated," Clara repeated, drawing back to look at him properly. "Tanner Adamson, do you truly believe I would kiss you out of obligation?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose not. You're far too stubborn for that." "Independent," she corrected with a small laugh. "And yes, I am, which is why you should know that I care for you too, not because you rescued me, but because of who you are. Your kindness, your integrity, your courage." Tanner's expression softened, and he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "In that case, Miss Harrington, I hope you'll allow me to court you properly once we're safe." "I'd like that," Clara replied, a warm happiness spreading through her despite the uncertainty of their situation. They stayed like that for a long moment, finding comfort in each other's presence. Eventually, Clara reluctantly stepped back. "I should try to sleep again," she said. "It's been a long day," Tanner nodded, though he seemed reluctant to let her go. "Sleep well, Clara." This time, when Clara returned to bed, sleep came quickly, her dreams filled not with fear but with possibilities for a future she hadn't dared to imagine before. The next morning, Thomas arrived early with fresh clothes for both of them, simple, practical garments that wouldn't draw attention. After a hearty breakfast, he drove them in his personal wagon to the hunting cabin he had mentioned. The cabin proved to be more substantial than Clara had expected, a sturdy structure built of local stone and timber, with a main room featuring a large fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. "It's perfect," she said, turning to Thomas with genuine gratitude. "How can we ever repay you?" "By staying safe," Thomas replied simply. "And perhaps by telling me the full story someday. I suspect there's more to your flight from Black than a simple case of a bride changing her mind." Tanner's expression darkened. "There is, and when the time is right, I'll share it with you." Thomas nodded, accepting this. "I've stocked the pantry and brought firewood. There's a stream nearby for fresh water. I'll return in a week to take you to meet the freight wagon." After Thomas departed, Clara and Tanner spent the remainder of the day settling into their temporary refuge. The cabin was isolated, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, with mountains rising in the distance. That evening, as they sat before the fire sharing a simple meal, Clara found herself contemplating their situation with a new perspective. For the first time since fleeing Las Lunas, they weren't actively running. They had a moment to breathe, to think about more than just survival. "What will you do when we reach California?" she asked Tanner, who was staring thoughtfully into the flames. He looked up, seeming surprised by the question. "I hadn't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "For so long, my only goal has been to bring Black to justice for Elizabeth's death, but now," he hesitated. "Now," Clara prompted gently. "Now I find myself thinking about other possibilities," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "A future that involves more than vengeance." Clara's heart quickened at his words. "What kind of future?" Tanner set aside his plate and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "One that might include that ranch I mentioned, good land, cattle, horses." "It sounds wonderful," Clara said softly. "It would be," Tanner agreed, "with the right person sharing it." He took her hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. "Clara, I know this is fast and our circumstances are unusual to say the least, but I need you to know that my feelings for you are real. Whatever happens, whatever you decide, that won't change." Clara turned to face him fully, her free hand coming up to rest against his cheek. "Tanner, in the short time I've known you, you've shown me more kindness and respect than most men I've known my entire life. I believe your feelings are real because mine are too." The kiss that followed was different from their first, deeper, more certain, filled with promise rather than just possibility. When they finally parted, both were breathless, and Clara felt a warmth coursing through her that had nothing to do with the nearby fire. "We should probably slow down," Tanner said, though his eyes suggested he was reluctant to do so. Clara nodded, equally reluctant but knowing he was right. "We have time now, a whole week at least." They spent that week in a kind of peaceful interlude, getting to know each other away from the immediate danger that had brought them together. During the days, they explored the area around the cabin, fished in the nearby stream, and gathered wild berries that grew in abundance. In the evenings, they talked for hours before the fire, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes, their fears. Clara learned that Tanner had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, and that he could recite poetry from memory, a skill taught to him by his mother. Tanner discovered that Clara was an excellent cook despite her privileged upbringing, and that she had a talent for sketching, filling the margins of an old ledger Thomas had left behind with drawings of the cabin and surrounding landscape. On their fourth day at the cabin, a summer storm rolled in, keeping them indoors. As rain pattered against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, Clara sat at the small table, writing a letter to her sister, explaining as best she could what had happened and her plans for the future. "Do you think it's safe to send this?" she asked Tanner, who was repairing a loose hinge on one of the cabinets. He considered the question. "Not yet, but we can take it with us to California and send it from there once we're settled. Black likely has people watching your sister's correspondence." Clara nodded, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into her pocket. "I miss her. She's only 16, too young to be dealing with all this alone." "We'll send for her as soon as it's safe," Tanner promised. "Thomas has connections throughout the territories. He can arrange discreet transport." Clara smiled gratefully, then turned her attention to another matter that had been troubling her. "Tanner, there's something I've been wondering. How did Black find us at that valley, the one where we were hiding when he and his men appeared on the ridge?" Tanner's expression grew serious. "I've been thinking about that too. It's possible they were just following our trail, but, Clara prompted when he hesitated. "But it felt like they knew exactly where to look," Tanner admitted. "Like they had information." "You think someone betrayed us?" Clara asked, alarmed. "It's possible," Tanner said, "though I can't imagine Sean Murphy or his family doing so." Clara considered this troubling possibility. "Who else knew our plans?" "No one specifically, but people saw us in Las Lunas before we fled. And Black has money enough to buy information from anyone who might have noticed which direction we headed." A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, followed by a crack of thunder that made Clara jump. Tanner crossed to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. "Try not to worry," he said gently. "We're safe here, and in a few days we'll be on our way west, far from Black's reach." Clara nodded, forcing a smile. "You're right, and I refuse to let fear ruin this time we have together." As if to emphasize her point, she leaned forward and kissed him, a bold move that surprised and delighted them both. Tanner responded eagerly, drawing her closer until she was practically in his lap, her hands tangled in his hair. The storm outside seemed to mirror the passion building between them, wild, unpredictable, and increasingly intense. When Tanner's lips moved from hers to trace a path down her neck, Clara gasped, overwhelmed by sensations she had never experienced before. "Tanner," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "We should," he pulled back immediately, his breathing as ragged as hers. "You're right, I'm sorry if I got carried away." "Don't apologize," Clara said, touching his face. "I want this, I want you, but we should wait," Tanner finished for her. "Until we're truly free, until I can court you properly, as you deserve." Clara smiled, touched by his consideration. "Yes, though it's not easy to be sensible when you're holding me like that." Tanner chuckled, pressing a chaste kiss to her forehead before helping her to her feet. "Then perhaps we should find a less tempting way to pass the stormy afternoon. Have I told you about the time my father and I tracked a mountain lion through the Sangre de Cristo range?" "You haven't," Clara replied, settling onto the sofa as Tanner began his tale. The remainder of their week at the cabin passed in this gentle rhythm of growing closeness and careful restraint. By the time Thomas returned to bring them to the freight wagon, Clara felt as though she had known Tanner for years rather than weeks, and the thought of building a future with him no longer seemed like a distant dream but a real possibility. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cool. Clara packed their few belongings while Tanner and Thomas discussed the route ahead. "The wagon master's name is Hector Mendoza," Thomas explained. He's been with my company for 15 years, trustworthy to his core. He knows only that you're friends of mine who need discreet passage west." "Thank you, Thomas," Tanner said, clasping his friend's hand. "I won't forget this." "See that you don't," Thomas replied with a grin. "I expect an invitation to the wedding." Clara, overhearing this, felt her cheeks warm. Thomas winked at her, clearly enjoying her embarrassment. "Now," he continued more seriously, "there's something else you should know. Word has reached Albuquerque that Black has increased the reward for your capture. He's claiming you stole valuable property in addition to, well, to Clara herself." Tanner's expression hardened. "That's a lie." "Of course it is," Thomas agreed. "But it gives him legal justification to pursue you beyond New Mexico territory. Be careful, both of you." The freight wagon was waiting at a small trading post about 10 miles from the cabin. It was part of a small caravan, 3 large wagons loaded with goods bound for settlements in Arizona territory. Hector Mendoza, a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard, greeted them warmly. "Any friends of Thomas are friends of mine," he said, showing them to the last wagon in the line. "You'll ride here. It's not the most comfortable, but we've made space among the cargo." The space was indeed cramped, a small area at the rear of the wagon cleared among crates of merchandise, but it offered privacy and, most importantly, anonymity. They set out shortly before noon, the wagons moving at a steady pace along the rutted trail that led northwest. Clara and Tanner sat side by side in their small sanctuary, watching the New Mexico landscape roll by through the gap in the canvas covering. "How long to Arizona territory?" Clara asked as they settled in for the journey. "About 10 days, according to Mendoza," Tanner replied. "From there, we'll need to find passage to California. Thomas has given me the names of contacts who can help." Clara nodded, leaning against Tanner's shoulder. "It seems strange to be heading so far from everything I've known, yet I'm not afraid." Tanner's arm slipped around her waist. "No, no," she confirmed, "because I'm not alone." She turned to look at him, her green eyes serious. "Whatever happens, Tanner, I want you to know that I don't regret any of this, even the danger, even leaving everything behind, because it brought me to you." Tanner's expression softened and he pressed a gentle kiss to her lips. "And I to you, Clara Harrington, and I to you." The first few days of their journey passed uneventfully. The wagon train moved steadily through increasingly rugged terrain, following ancient trails that wound through mountains and across high plateaus. Clara and Tanner kept to themselves, emerging only at night when the caravan made camp, always careful to avoid the occasional other travelers they encountered at rest stops. On the 5th day, as they crossed into Arizona territory, Mendoza brought troubling news. "There are riders behind us," he told Tanner quietly as they made camp that evening. "Been following since morning. Could be nothing, but they're keeping their distance, watching." Tanner's hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his hip. "How many?" "4, maybe 5, Mendoza replied. "Too far to identify, but they're well mounted, not typical bandits." Clara, hearing this, felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in her stomach. "Black's men, possibly," Tanner agreed grimly, "or lawmen he's convinced to help him." He turned to Mendoza. "How much farther to the next settlement?" 2 days to Fort Defiance, the wagon master said. "But there's a mining camp about a day's ride north of our current route. Rough place, but they don't ask questions." Tanner considered their options. "If we split off toward the mining camp, we risk being caught in the open. If we stay with the wagons, we endanger everyone here." It was an impossible choice, but Mendoza made it for them. "My wagons, my decision," he said firmly. "You stay with us to Fort Defiance. There's an army detachment there. Whatever these men want, they'll think twice about causing trouble with soldiers nearby." Tanner looked as though he wanted to argue, but Clara laid a hand on his arm. "He's right," she said softly. "It's our best chance." That night they took turns keeping watch, but the riders Mendoza had spotted maintained their distance, visible only as small campfires far behind them. By morning, there was no sign of them at all. "Maybe they've given up," Clara suggested hopefully as they resumed their journey. Tanner's expression remained wary, "Or they're circling around to get ahead of us." His caution proved prescient. By mid-afternoon, as the wagon train navigated a narrow pass between towering rock formations, Mendoza suddenly called for a halt. "Riders ahead," he announced, his voice tight. "Blocking the trail." Tanner moved to the front of their wagon, peering through the gap in the canvas. Clara followed, her heart pounding. Sure enough, about 100 yards ahead, 5 mounted men had positioned themselves across the trail, their stance unmistakably confrontational. "It's them," Clara whispered, recognizing one of the men as Jenkins, Black's foreman. "Black's men." Tanner's expression hardened. "Stay here," he instructed, checking his pistol before jumping down from the wagon. Clara grabbed his arm. "No, it's too dangerous." "I need to help Mendoza deal with this," Tanner insisted. "These men won't hesitate to harm anyone who stands in their way." Clara wanted to protest further, but she knew he was right. Black's men were dangerous, and Mendoza and his drivers would be at risk. "Be careful," she urged. Tanner squeezed her hand briefly before moving to join Mendoza at the head of the caravan. Clara watched anxiously as the two men conferred, then began walking slowly toward the waiting riders, their hands deliberately visible and away from their weapons. The distance was too great for Clara to hear what was being said, but the body language of all involved was tense. She saw Jenkins gesture emphatically, pointing toward the wagons. Mendoza shook his head. Tanner stood silent beside him, his stance deceptively relaxed, though Clara knew he was poised to react at the first sign of trouble. After what seemed an eternity, Mendoza and Tanner turned and walked back toward the wagons. The riders remained where they were, blocking the path. What happened? Clara asked as Tanner returned to their wagon. "They claim to be lawmen from New Mexico territory," Tanner explained, his voice low. "They have a warrant for our arrest for theft and kidnapping." Clara's blood ran cold. "But that's not true." "Of course not, but they have the paper to back it up," Tanner said grimly. "Black has been busy." "What do we do now?" Clara asked, trying to stay calm despite her rising panic. Tanner's expression was determined. "Mendoza's going to attempt to negotiate passage. If that fails," he hesitated. "If that fails, we'll have to try another approach." Before Clara could ask what he meant, shots rang out. Instinctively, she ducked and Tanner pulled her down beside him. "It's not aimed at us," he said, peering cautiously over the edge of the wagon. "Someone's firing from the rocks above." Indeed, a new commotion had erupted ahead. The supposed lawmen had scattered, taking cover as bullets kicked up dust around them. From the rock formations flanking the trail, more gunfire erupted. "What's happening?" Clara gasped, clinging to Tanner's arm. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But it might be our chance. Stay low." The gunfight continued for several minutes, neither side apparently willing to advance. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. In the silence that followed, a voice called out from the rocks, "Mendoza, get those wagons moving while you can." The wagon master didn't hesitate. "Hiya," he shouted, whipping his team into motion. The other drivers followed suit, and the caravan lurched forward, picking up speed as they approached the spot where Black's men had been blocking the trail. The supposed lawmen had retreated to a more defensible position away from the path, clearly unwilling to expose themselves to further fire from the unseen shooters in the rocks. As the wagons rumbled past, Clara caught a glimpse of Jenkins's face, contorted with rage and frustration. "Who was shooting?" she asked once they were safely through the pass. Tanner shook his head, looking as bewildered as she felt. "I don't know, but whoever it was, they knew Mendoza by name." As the wagons continued on, putting distance between themselves and the confrontation, a lone rider emerged from a side trail, galloping to catch up with the caravan. Mendoza slowed his lead wagon, allowing the rider to approach. To Clara's astonishment, it was a woman dressed in men's clothing, with a battered hat pulled low over her face and a rifle strapped to her back. She rode with the confidence of someone born to the saddle. "Mendoza, you old devil," she called as she drew alongside. "Cutting it close this time, weren't you?" The wagon master's booming laugh echoed off the canyon walls. "Maria Santos, I might have known it was you causing trouble back there." The woman Maria grinned, pushing her hat back to reveal a striking face with sharp features and laughing dark eyes. Those men have been trailing you for 2 days, thought you might need a hand. And the others shooting from the rocks, Mendoza asked. Maria winked. Just me and some well-placed rifles. Amazing what a little planning and quick movement can accomplish. She glanced toward the wagon where Clara and Tanner were watching, her expression turning curious. These the ones those men were after, Mendoza nodded. Friends of Thomas Wilson from Albuquerque. Then they're friends of mine too, Maria decided. Though you might want to introduce us properly when we make camp. For now, keep moving. Those men will regroup soon enough. With that, she spurred her horse ahead, taking the lead position as though she had been guiding the caravan all along. Who is she? Clara whispered to Tanner, fascinated by this unexpected ally. I have no idea, Tanner admitted, but Mendoza seems to trust her, and right now that's good enough for me. They continued until nightfall, making camp in a sheltered valley beside a small creek. Maria Santos helped establish a perimeter, positioning herself on a rocky outcrop where she could watch the trail behind them. Once the camp was secured, Mendoza brought her to meet Clara and Tanner, who had emerged from their wagon but remained close to it, wary of being seen. Maria Santos, Mendoza introduced her formally. Best scout in the territory and a friend to those who deserve it. Maria, this is Tanner Adamson and Clara Harrington. Maria studied them both with intelligent eyes. So you're the ones who got Jeremiah Black's britches in a twist, she said with a hint of admiration. Must be quite a story. It is, Tanner acknowledged, and one we owe you for helping to continue. Maria waved away his thanks. I've had my own run-ins with Black. Man tried to steal my family's ranch near Las Lunas 3 years ago. Failed, but not for lack of trying. She eyed Clara speculatively. You were to be his wife, Clara nodded. Against my will, he claimed to have purchased my father's debts. Typical Black tactic, Maria snorted. Man collects people's misfortunes like some collect stamps. As they shared a simple meal around a small fire, Clara found herself warming to this unconventional woman. Maria Santos had a direct manner and a wry sense of humor that put everyone at ease despite the danger they had faced. Where are you headed? Maria asked as they finished eating. California eventually, Tanner replied. We need to get beyond Black's reach. Maria nodded thoughtfully. Good choice, but those men will be persistent. Black pays well for loyalty. She turned to Mendoza. I think I'll ride with your caravan to Fort Defiance if you don't mind the company. Always welcome, the wagon master assured her. That night, as Clara and Tanner settled into their makeshift bed in the wagon, she found herself thinking about Maria Santos, a woman who lived life entirely on her own terms, unbound by society's expectations. She's remarkable, Clara murmured, nestled against Tanner's side. She is, he agreed. Reminds me a bit of you, Clara laughed softly. Me, I'm nothing like her. Aren't you? Tanner propped himself up on one elbow to look at her in the dim light. You've shown incredible courage these past weeks. You've defied a powerful man, risked everything for freedom. That takes the same kind of spirit Maria has, Clara considered this. I suppose I never thought of myself as particularly brave. I've always done what was expected of me. Until now, Tanner pointed out. And look at you adapting to life on the trail, facing dangers most women would faint at the mere mention of. You're stronger than you know, Clara Harrington. Warmth spread through her at his words. If I am strong, it's because I have something worth being strong for, she said softly, reaching up to touch his face. Tanner caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. When we reach California, he began, then hesitated. Yes, Clara prompted, her heart quickening. When we reach California, I want to ask you something important, Tanner said, but I want to do it properly when we're truly free and safe. Clara smiled, understanding perfectly what he wasn't quite saying. I look forward to that day. Their journey to Fort Defiance continued without further incident, though Maria insisted on maintaining vigilant watches. The fort, when they reached it 2 days later, was a welcome sight, a substantial military outpost that represented safety and the rule of law. The commanding officer, a Captain James Foster, listened with interest to Mendoza's account of the confrontation in the pass. When Tanner and Clara were brought forward to tell their side of the story, the captain's initial skepticism gave way to concern. "I know Jeremiah Black by reputation," he said, stroking his mustache thoughtfully. "Not a man to cross lightly. But these men claiming to be territorial lawmen, they have no jurisdiction here in Arizona territory, especially without proper documentation from our authorities." "Then you won't turn us over to them if they arrive?" Clara asked anxiously. Captain Foster shook his head. "No, madam, not without proper extradition papers, which would require a review by a federal judge. That would take weeks at minimum." Relief washed over Clara. For the first time since their flight began, they had found an official willing to uphold the law rather than bow to Black's influence. "Thank you, Captain," Tanner said sincerely. "Don't thank me yet," Foster cautioned. "Black's men may still attempt to take matters into their own hands. I suggest you continue your journey as soon as possible. I can provide an escort to the next settlement, which would deter most troublemakers." "That won't be necessary," Maria Santos interjected. "I'll be continuing west with them. Between me and Mendoza's men, we can handle any further interference." The captain eyed Maria with a mixture of respect and exasperation that suggested they had a history. "As capable as ever, I see, Miss Santos." "It's Mrs. Santos Vaughn now, Captain," she corrected with a grin. "But I still shoot straighter than any of your troopers." They spent one night at the fort, enjoying the luxury of proper beds and hot meals. The following morning, as they prepared to depart, Captain Foster approached with unexpected news. "A telegraph came through this morning," he informed them. "From the U.S. Marshal's office in Albuquerque. It seems there's been a development in your case." Clara's heart sank. "What kind of development?" "A positive one, surprisingly," Foster replied. "Jeremiah Black has been arrested." "Arrested?" Tanner repeated, disbelieving. "On what charges?" "Fraud, initially," the captain said, consulting the telegram. "Something about falsifying documents related to land transactions. But the investigation has expanded to include other matters, including the suspicious death of his previous wife." Clara gasped, looking at Tanner, whose expression had transformed from shock to grim satisfaction. "Elizabeth," he whispered. "Finally." "The marshal requests that you return to Albuquerque to give statements," Foster continued, "but emphasizes that you are witnesses, not suspects. He also mentioned that certain debts claimed by Black appear to have been fabricated." Clara's legs felt suddenly weak, and she gripped Tanner's arm for support. "Is this real?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. "The telegram is authentic," Foster assured her. "Verified through official channels." Tanner's arm slipped around Clara's waist, steadying her. "What do you want to do?" he asked softly. "We can continue to California as planned, or we can go back," Clara finished, her mind racing with the implications. If Black truly had falsified the debts, if he was facing justice for his crimes, perhaps she didn't need to flee so far after all. And her sister, she could bring her west more easily from Albuquerque than from California. "I think we should return," she decided finally. "Face this directly rather than running." Tanner nodded, his expression resolute. Together, the journey back to Albuquerque was considerably less fraught than their westward trek had been. Captain Foster provided them with a letter confirming their status as witnesses rather than fugitives, which eased their passage through checkpoints and settlements. Maria Santos Vaughn accompanied them as far as a trading post near the territorial border, where she needed to diverge to attend to her own business. "Take care of yourselves," she said as they parted ways. "And if you ever need help again, my ranch is just outside Las Lunas. Santos Creek Ranch, anyone can direct you." "Thank you, Maria," Clara said warmly, embracing the woman who had become a friend in such a short time. "For everything." "Just doing what anyone with sense would do," Maria replied with a wink. "And if you do settle somewhere nearby, come visit. My husband would love to meet the people who helped bring Black down." The remainder of the journey passed quickly, and within a week, they were approaching Albuquerque. Thomas Wilson met them at the outskirts of the city, having been notified of their return by telegraph. "You two have caused quite a stir," he greeted them with a broad smile. "Black's arrest is the talk of the territory. What exactly happened? Tanner asked as they made their way to Thomas's office. From what I gather, when Black couldn't find you, he became increasingly desperate, Thomas explained. He started making mistakes, threatening the wrong people. One of those people was a federal land agent who decided to take a closer look at Black's recent acquisitions. And they found evidence of fraud, Clara surmised. Thomas nodded. That was just the beginning. Once people realized Black was vulnerable, more came forward with accusations. Former employees, business associates he'd cheated, even the local doctor who had treated his late wife's injuries before her death. And the debts? Clara asked anxiously. The ones he claimed my father owed, fabricated as far as anyone can tell, Thomas confirmed. Your cousin Edward has been questioned extensively about his role in the deception. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Edward was part of it. It appears Black paid him to convince you of the danger to your sister and your family's assets, Thomas said grimly. Your cousin has been most cooperative since his arrest, eager to reduce his own sentence by providing evidence against Black. Clara felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the debts weren't real, anger at her cousin's betrayal, and overwhelming gratitude that the nightmare was finally ending. The following days were a whirlwind of meetings with law enforcement officials, statements given and signed, and discussions about the case against Jeremiah Black. Each new revelation confirmed what Tanner had suspected all along, that Black was not merely a bully and a controlling husband, but a criminal who had been operating with impunity for years. Most importantly for Clara, she was able to send a telegraph to her sister, assuring her of her safety and inviting her to join her in New Mexico territory. The response came quickly: eager acceptance and promises to arrive on the next available train east. Throughout it all, Tanner remained by her side, a steady presence that anchored her amid the chaos. In the evenings, they would retreat to Thomas's home, where he had insisted they stay as guests and talk about the future that was suddenly open to them. What do you think about staying in New Mexico? Tanner asked one night as they sat in Thomas's garden, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and pink. Clara considered the question. I've grown fond of it despite everything. There's a freedom here that I never felt back east. Tanner nodded, taking her hand. I've been thinking about that ranch I mentioned, the one I've always wanted. There's land available near Santa Fe, good grazing country with water rights. It sounds perfect, Clara said softly, a place of our own. It could be, Tanner agreed, his expression suddenly serious. Clara, I had planned to wait until we reached California to ask this, but now… He slid from the bench where they were sitting to kneel before her, still holding her hand. I know our time together has been unusual, marked by danger and uncertainty, but through it all, my feelings for you have only grown stronger. Clara's heart pounded as she realized what was happening. I love you, Clara Harrington, Tanner said simply. Your courage, your kindness, your remarkable spirit. I want to build that ranch with you, to create a home and a life together. Will you marry me? Tears sprang to Clara's eyes, not of fear or sadness but pure joy. Yes, she whispered, then more firmly, yes, Tanner Adamson, I will marry you. He pulled a small ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a single small sapphire. I bought this yesterday, he admitted. It's not grand, but it's beautiful, Clara interrupted, allowing him to slip it onto her finger. Perfect, in fact. The kiss they shared sealed their commitment, not a desperate embrace stolen in the midst of flight, but a promise freely given and joyfully received. 2 months later, on a bright autumn day, Clara Harrington became Clara Adamson in a small ceremony at the Santa Fe courthouse. Her sister, Emma, now happily settled with her in their new home, served as her only attendant. Thomas Wilson stood as Tanner's best man, while Maria Santos Vaughn and her husband were honored guests. The ranch Tanner had purchased was everything he had described: 200 acres of good land with a modest house that they were gradually making their own. Clara had already made inquiries about teaching positions at the nearby settlement, determined to fulfill that long-held dream as well. As for Jeremiah Black, his trial had revealed the full extent of his crimes, resulting in a lengthy prison sentence. The man who had once seemed all-powerful was now powerless, his empire crumbling as those he had wronged finally found justice. On the evening of their wedding day, Tanner led Clara out onto the porch of their new home. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land that was now theirs. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist from behind. "Completely," Clara replied, leaning back against his chest. "It's strange to think that if Black hadn't forced me into that marriage, we might never have met." "Perhaps fate has a sense of irony," Tanner suggested, pressing a kiss to her temple. Clara turned in his arms to face him. "Or perhaps it simply knows that sometimes we have to face our greatest fears to find our greatest happiness." Tanner smiled, drawing her closer. "Well, Mrs. Adamson, I can promise you your days of fear are over. From now on, it's just us, this land, and whatever future we choose to build together." "That sounds perfect," Clara whispered, rising on her toes to kiss her husband as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bright beacons of a promising future that once had seemed impossible but now stretched endlessly before them. In the years that followed, the Adamson ranch flourished. Tanner's knowledge of the land and Clara's careful management turned their modest beginning into one of the most respected operations in the territory. Their home grew as well, with the addition of a larger kitchen where Clara taught Emma to cook, and eventually, a nursery. Their first child, a son they named James after Tanner's father, arrived on a snowy winter night 2 years after their wedding. He was followed by a daughter, Elizabeth, named for Tanner's sister, and later another son, William. Clara did indeed become a teacher, starting with a small school in their home for the children of neighboring ranchers, which eventually grew into the first proper schoolhouse in the area. Her sister Emma, who had inherited their mother's artistic talent, became a respected illustrator for scientific expeditions throughout the West. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they watched their children playing in the yard of the home they had built together, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked Tanner. "When you came to the back door of Black's mansion and offered to help me escape," Tanner smiled, taking her hand and running his thumb over the simple gold band that had replaced the sapphire engagement ring for everyday wear. "Sometimes, I was terrified you'd refuse." "I almost did," Clara admitted. "I was so afraid." "And now?" Tanner asked, his blue eyes warm as they met hers. Clara looked around at their home, their land, their children, the life they had created together from the ashes of what might have been a tragedy. "Now," she said softly, "I can't remember what fear feels like." Tanner pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her lips that still held all the tenderness and passion of their first embraces. "Good," he murmured. "That's exactly as it should be." And as the sun set behind the mountains they had come to love, casting its golden light over the land that was their sanctuary and their future, Clara Adamson knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety, but true happiness, a life built on love, courage, and the freedom to choose her own path.